Now, as we mentioned, services should always be minimally intrusive to the user. But there are some cases where the activities of a service are something that are directly affecting the user. They have some kind of closer relationship than normal to the user. We call those foreground services. And when we think about a foreground service, kind of the classic example is a music player, right? It's something that's running in the background. The user's not directly interacting with it, but they're certainly very aware of the experience, right? They're listening to the sound, right? And there are a number of applications that can kind of fall into that kind of framework, right? Any kind of monitoring system. Lots of those scenarios where the user is aware it's going on in the background, but they're just not really interacting with it directly the same way they would with something that was activity-based. Now, when something is a foreground service, there are some special things about it. One thing is that it actually does have a small bit of visibility. It doesn't really have a user interface, but it does have the ability to put information into the status bar of the device. So you can have an icon up there. You can also have some text that's visible when the user views the status bar. And when the user selects your entry in the status bar, you can actually trigger an action, such as bringing up an activity or some other behavior. The other thing that's very important about foreground services is that even though all services are considered kind of more important than average, right? They actually are less likely to be killed than the activities the user isn't currently interacting with. Foreground services are even further elevated. For all intent and purposes, a foreground service runs with the same level of importance as the application the user is actively interacting with. There is a tiny bit of difference. If the device becomes under very extreme pressure, it may kill the foreground service. But if that was starting to happen, you'd probably start having other problems on the device because it only really starts to happen under very extreme scenarios. The thing that's important to note is that a service that's running in the foreground state, it's basically has that ability to control it. A service can actually start out as a normal service, elevate itself to the foreground state, and then at any time take itself back out of it. So now when it comes to implementing a foreground service, the really important point there is that there is no real difference in the way you write that service. Right? Everything we've talked about in terms of inheriting from the service class, the things we do inside of the manifest, all that's the same. The key thing that's different is that the service simply tells the system that it wants to run in the foreground state. And it does that by calling start foreground. Now, when it calls start foreground, a couple of important things happen. One thing is that it elevates its importance to foreground, which means it's much less likely to be terminated. The other thing, though, is that it has that ability to provide information to the user through that notification class, right? The ability to interact, or I shouldn't say react, the ability to actually put information into the status bar. And when it comes time to leave the foreground state, again, all a service has to do is say stop foreground. The service can continue running if that makes sense for the service. If it doesn't, of course, as part of the normal shutdown process, the service can take itself out of the foreground state. And if any time, if that service is shut down for any reason, the system, of course, does all the cleanup to take it out of the foreground state. It takes care of cleaning up all the status that might be out there and all those sorts of things. Now, when it comes to programming foreground services, the main thing that's different for us, beyond simply just calling something like start foreground, is the notification instance. That notification instance is really our way of letting the user know what's going on out there. Right, so it doesn't really have a user interface, but that notification gives us the ability to do lots of things. Because as we put information into the status bar, we don't just have a one-shot chance of putting the information out there. We can actually update that as time goes on. So we can have an icon of one sort at different parts of our program, and then change them at other times as we need to. We can modify the text. We can modify what happens when the user actually selects our entry in the status bar. So we have a very fluid relationship there. Kind of a classic example you'll see is like weather applications. Weather applications will often have a standard icon they show in the status bar, but if you've signed up for severe weather alerts, you'll commonly notice that the icon for that application will switch to something like a big red exclamation point, right, to tell you that there's a weather alert. And it may be normally when you actually look at the status bar for that weather application, if you tap on it, it just shows you the current weather. But if there's a severe weather alert and you tap on it in the status bar, it automatically takes you to the weather alert screen, those sort of things. So there's a lot of opportunity there, not necessarily to interact in a traditional sense of back and forth, but certainly to provide feedback to the user. And then if the user does interact with your status information, to have your service trigger some action that makes the most sense for that scenario. Now, when it comes to dealing with your notifications, there's actually a series of things that happen. Right now, as we said, the notification is all about providing information in the status bar. And one of your first things is that icon, right? That's really kind of your kind of very visible relationship with your user, right? So the icon shows up when you first start the service. It actually stays up in the status bar at all times. Now, when you first start up your service, you'll have a chance to display some ticker text. So some text will actually roll into the status bar at the top, and will stay there for just a few seconds to give the user some initial information about something that's going on. It's often a really good way just to indicate to the user that, hey, that thing they asked for is starting up. But then once you've got the information up there, again, there are a number of pieces of information you can provide. You can actually provide what we call the title text, which in our case, you see there, is something that says Pluralsight Service. You can provide informative text. And there's even a timestamp on there. Right? Again, you notice the icon is visible there as well. Where the timestamp is important is that generally you want to kind of set that to the time whenever you've changed something in a status message, because the messages show up in the status bar, if there are multiples, based on that timestamp.